As a kid, I wasn't very well behaved. So I always get this warning from my parents. And when I really messed up, they come up with this statement that, son, sit down, we want to tell you a story. This is the study about the stories that my parents told me. And I know that it's not a convincing motivation for doing the econ research. So let me just talk a little bit about motivation that drives our research. So basically, it's right now, it's a well-established textbook fact that the historical events has an effect on economic outcome. And one of the mechanisms that we usually talk about is through social norm. And literature in this area argues that a specific historical event has an effect on a past culture, and then past culture persists over the time, coming to the present culture and into our behavior. For example, like the presentations that we saw this morning about French Revolution and so on. So, and there are also the literature, empirical evidence showing that, there are historical events happening, and there are changes in our behavior at the present time. I brought a couple of examples, which I believe all of you are familiar with, so I don't need to go through them. But one of the main challenges that these studies face is that they observe a historical events, and then they also observe the culture at the present time. They are missing this piece of the chain in the past. And this is what we are addressing in this paper. We are trying to come up with a data set that really gives you an access to the culture in the past. And when I say culture, I mean the social norms and values. I skip also the motivation, the second motivation, because now I think you know that what we are doing in this state. And basically, we have two main research questions. First, we are asking whether culture in the past, to some extent, correlate with the culture at the present time. And second, whether this culture in the past explain or predict economic outcome at the present time. So, how do we do that? Basically, we rely on the folktale narratives. In the paper, we argue extensively why we use these sources of the data. And these sources of the data come with many challenges, which some of them we try to solve, but some of them remain unsolved. Then what we do, we use large language model to elicit social norms and values out of the text of these documents. And then we try to aggregate the data and reduce the dimensionality of our data set. Finally, we simply correlate our past culture with the present culture and run a very stupid coalesce regression to show that our economic growth is to some extent explained by our social norms and values in the past. So what do we find? We find that, okay, past culture do correlate with the present culture. We also find out that our indicators of the culture explain significantly average economic growth between 1990s and 2019. And we believe that our paper is somehow new part of this puzzle about the persistency of the culture over the time. So this is the point that I already told you the whole paper. So if you want to start working with your computer or your mobile, you're feel free to do that, because I'm going to the depths of how we did it from now. So where does these folktales come from? Basically, they come from three sources. First, there are a couple of digitized archives that we scraped. Second, there are also digital documents that we collected. And these are including folklore journals and also digitized anthologies that we used. And still we were missing some countries. And for those countries, we literally went to the library, scanned the book, and convert them to the machine readable text. Yeah.
We are saying more about this, but I'm actually kind of skeptical by this point because if you're working with folktales and you wanted to use the information in terms of timing, I mean, to me, you will probably know when they were published, most likely. But the true timing of those tales are usually much more ancient. So I wonder, like, what are you capturing exactly here?
Yeah, so what we try to do, we are trying to do that. So we can't really say about the age of the folktale, as you also said it in your paper. But what we make sure is that the publication of the document should be at least 150 years old. So it should have been appeared 150 years old. Otherwise, we didn't include it in our data. Yeah.
Basically, you're not going to use or say very much about the actual time.
No.
I will see it. Yeah.
No.
I will wait to see it.
Yeah. So that gives us around 27,000 unique folktales from 176 countries. Of course, the data are not equally distributed. The data points are not equally distributed across different countries. For some European countries, we have so many folktales because they have this tradition of the collecting folktales. But for other countries, we have a few. But we made a threshold that we should at least have 30 folktales for a country to be included in our analysis. This is not such an arbitrary number. We actually test statistically that this 30 is also a meaningful number. And at least, so 42% of our corpus is in English, but the rest are in other languages. So what we try to do is that we try to use DeepL and GPT to translate them. We also test whether there is a difference between a human translation and machine translation. There is no significant difference between them. So, yeah.
This seems like a really small number. Yeah, you know, I have actually a new paper on China, and that has over 20,000 tales.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know if there's some way you can expand your data set. I think 27,000 for the whole world, it just seems like a too small.
Too small number. Okay. Then this is how we engineered our prompts to feed to the GPT. We end up with the 77 prompts, which are mostly theoretically driven. So we argue that for each prompt, to some extent, exists a literature. But for each prompt, there is a literature that tells you, okay, it has an effect on economic developments and so on. So then each prompt is converted to the encouraging, discouraging a norm, encouraging the norm, and whether the topic is discussed in the text. So, and then we end up with a 216 variable. When we aggregate the data, we come up with a measurement for how much a specific behavior is how much a specific behavior is encouraged or discouraged in the culture, in a specific culture. And here, for example, this is norm violence, and there is this prejudice in the culture between Germans and Switzerland, that Germans are very rule following, but the Swiss people are much more intuitive based on a fairness, and we see that this is reflected also in the number of the folktales talking about the folktales. So then what we want to talk about is more cultural traits, and the cultural traits are not the output of the one single social norm, rather it's a bundle of social norms. And how we try to do is that we come up with the 7 categories that we think it's relevant for economic development, and then we categorize our variables into these 7 categories, and then run a function analysis. Our data set gives you the opportunity to come up with different categories for different other variables as well. So there are these 2 strands of the literature in the cultural economics. One is they try to rely more on geography, another on the culture, and the culture is this culture literature always faced with the problem of the migration. And Potterman and White came up with a matrix where you can adjust your variables based on a migration between 1500 and 2000. So we also adjust our variables. So any kind of data coming out of the GPT or any large language model should be validated checked. So we came up with a framework and said that a data should be whether internally, both internally and externally valid. So internally validation of the data means that you have variables that are overlapping. So GPT or a large language model should answer these two variables identically. And this is actually the case in our data sets. And also we have this external validity where we have to find out relevant data sets that are can be correlated with our data set. Of course, the first data set that comes to our mind is the Melanie and Stelios data sets and the motives. And I want to use this channel opportunity to discuss how our data set is different from their data set. Basically, they are the pioneer in the field. They introduced amazing data sets, and they also are very upfront about the challenges that comes with the usage of their data sets. And the challenges that they listed in their paper was our guideline to solve some of the problems. So this is a table where we explain how our data is different from their data. Basically, they rely on a motive, we rely on whole text, and we are saying that there's this say that devil is in the detail. So that's also addition to the literature. So they're relying on they can say something about the presence of the social norm, but we can also say something about the intensity of the social norm, how many times a social norm is discussed. We can also, they don't have a heterogeneity measurement where how heterogeneous a social norm is. We can also produce a heterogeneity sort of measurement for our data set. And I think the last point is much more important. They have their documentation doesn't have enough information for some of the variables which we address this problem. And I want to show you this point by three graphs. And here, on the x-axis, you see the R variable, and on y-axis, you see the motive data sets. And we are measuring how many times a folk in the country talk about the cooperation. And you can see it's a slightly meaningful correlation between our data sets and their data sets. This becomes even stronger when the cooperation is with the stranger. And it's interesting that they are capturing this cooperation with a stranger, but when it comes to the cooperation with a peer, their variable doesn't capture that. So this is what I mean by capturing the details. And you know that it's important whether you cooperate with a stranger or you cooperate with a peer. So back to the estimations. And we did a bunch of other, so let me see, 5 minutes. Yeah, okay, run with yeah. So we did a other bunch of external validity and also robustness check. I'm not going to show you how our culture in the past correlated the culture in the present. Sorry about that. And also, I'm not going to show you how we use epidemiological approach to show the persistence of the culture. What I'm going to show you is the correlation between our variables and here and the cooperation is the factor level. It's a bundle of the variables that we thought it's going to be conducive to cooperation, and average growth rate of the GDP per capita, and you see a slight positive correlation. A higher level of the cooperation factor in a country means the higher level of the a larger growth rate for the per capita income. And of course, it's not enough to just take a look at the raw data. We also run the estimations. We took a canonical model from Barrel in 1990s. We included the three main standard explanatory variables for the average growth rate, and we use the data from Pentable, and you can see that our variables and cooperation factor significantly correlate with other with the average growth rate between 1990s and 2000 between 1990s and 2019. Yeah.
Can you just explain what does 0.5 roughly mean?
So it means that a change in one standard deviation in a cooperation leads to a 0.5% increase, and it is a huge number, yeah. But a change in one standard deviation of the cooperation factor is also very huge. We don't see that in our data. So, and here in the column 6 and column 8, we divided our data set between our rich and poor country, and you can see that our effect is mainly driven by poor countries. And I talk about 7 factors, and you can see that all of our 7 factors significantly correlated with average growth rate. So we also did a bunch of the robustness checks, and they are not changing our results. So let me conclude a little bit. Basically, I told you that about this slide. We are introducing a data set that are capturing the culture in the past. We show that our historical culture in the past. I'm coming to your questions very soon. So historical norms and values correlate with our current culture, and also we show that our factors correlate with a higher growth rate. This is probably what we should also look in the future. That's at least how we see it. So thank you.
There are 2 more minutes actually, so we can take some questions. What should you say?
Yeah.
Just for my understanding, what's the correlation?
Cooperation and level of income. They correlate with each other, but you mean real GDP per capita? They correlate with each other. Positive, yeah. We took a 2005, which is a typical year that literature also use, so they correlate with each other.
Okay, so the one thing that would be nice to do is to correlate your measure of past culture with other measure of past culture that have been produced by the literature. For example, I have one series of papers that looked at the culture in Europe during the medieval period, which was a cultural cooperation. Jago and I have a paper on this on cultural cooperation in Mesopotamia 3,000 years ago. It would be nice to see whether you can correlate these with some outcome-based measure of culture in the past.
Sure, but I will contact you about the paper. Thank you.
Clarification or maybe comments. So you started with showing that like adherence to norms rather than defiance to norms is higher in one country than another, Germany and Switzerland specifically. But I'm a little, I like much of this, but I'm a little skeptical about this because you can express a norm in opposite ways and then it can be adherence or not, right? So you can adhere to the norm of challenging authority, or you can defy that norm, but defying the norm means adhering to the norm of like, you know, just following of social cohesion, right? So it just seems a bit weird to think in this way, I think, because you can always express a norm, or very often you can express one norm and an opposite norm, and then you can adhere to the opposite norm, which is not necessarily defying. Yeah, so that's just maybe food for thought. Right?
Yeah, I have to think about it. It's another level of the complexity of the text that we can address, and we should think about it, how we should address that problem.
Yeah, all right, thanks a lot.
Thanks.